Good afternoon. My name is Maura Policelli, and I'm the Executive Director of the Keough School of Global Affairs Washington Office. The Keough School is the first new school in a century at the University of Notre Dame. And I'm honored to be hosting our conversation today with Senator Chris Murphy from Connecticut. Many of you have sent in questions in advance for Senator Murphy, and we'll get through them as quickly as possible, get in as many as possible. But also during this conversation, you can submit a question by clicking on the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and submit a question there, and we'll add that to the queue and get through as many as possible. Please include your affiliation if you'd like, and we'll get to those shortly. So now let me introduce Senator Chris Murphy. It's nice to have you with us today. Senator Murphy is from Connecticut. He's on the Senate Appropriations Committee, the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee, and most relevant to today's conversation, he's on the Foreign Relations Committee and the top Democrat on the subcommittee on the Near East, South Asia, Central Asia, and counterterrorism. So thank you for being here, Senator.
Good to see you, Maura. Thank you very much for having me. Great to be spending the next hour with you and representatives and affiliates of the school.
Thank you so much. I know it's a busy time for you. So on behalf of Notre Dame and the Keough School, thank you for taking this time. We are joined today by dozens of our students, faculty, staff, alumni, friends, along with U.S. government officials, policy experts from international development organizations and other universities, representatives of several foreign embassies, and the media. So we have a great group, and it'll be a fast hour, knowing this is one of the busiest weeks in particular during a busy time in Washington. And before we switch to the foreign policy issues at hand, can you just give us a snapshot of how the week is going with the spending package under debate and 2 COVID relief bills amidst the presidential transition and all of the other big news? And congratulations on getting vaccinations into Connecticut. But can you just give us a snapshot of how this week is going on the Hill?
Sure. Well, yesterday was a big day for the country. The Electoral College confirming what we have known since election night, or the next morning, that Joe Biden is going to be the next president of the United States, and vaccinations beginning all across the country. Today, we are deep in negotiations, as you mentioned, Maura, trying to get 50% plus one of the Senate and House to yes on a COVID relief package. This is desperately necessary. Unemployment benefits are running out at the end of the year. Evictions are going to start back up again. There are small businesses shuttering their doors all over the country, especially in cold weather states where it's hard for restaurants to be able to stay open through the winter. Desperate times are spreading all across the country, and the federal government has to step up and help, or we're going to be facing, literal starvation over the course of the winter. We're already facing that in some corners of Connecticut. I don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good, so I'm going to be willing to compromise. But I will tell you, it will be difficult for many of us to swallow a relief package that doesn't have funding for states and local governments. Connecticut has spent a lot of money, especially because we were one of the states that was hardest hit early on. We had to, work through a lot of trial and error. In the end, perfecting a model of response that we made available to the rest of the country. Most other states didn't choose to copy what we did, and so they've had, an uncontrolled spread in a way that we haven't in Connecticut. But we're still hemorrhaging money, and we need some assistance so that our state can stay above water, and so that we have the flexibility to fund the kind of operations we're going to need heading into next year. For instance, the president is saying that states don't need any money to distribute the vaccine. That's nonsense. We need billions of dollars to be able to fund the kind of complicated distribution effort that is necessary to distribute multiple vaccines and vaccines that require really complicated storage and multiple doses. Chances, I said yesterday on a number of these calls was less than 50-50. I guess today I would say chances are a little bit better than 50-50 that we end up getting a deal. It may not have in it everything that all of us want. It may have in it more than some Republicans want, but we can't go home for Christmas without having done our duty, which is to make sure that this country doesn't fall into destitution over the course of this winter. So we're going to stay here for as long as it takes. I've got little kids who are excited to. Actually, it's not so little anymore, but I've got kids who still get very excited about Christmas. But I'm prepared to stay here in Washington until we get this bill passed and signed by the president.
Well, good luck with this very intense week you're in the middle of. So again, thank you for taking this hour with us, given all that you have going on. And we will be talking about an array of foreign policy issues. So it's going to be a bit of a tour de force. And any of these topics could probably take an hour in and of itself, but we'll try to get through, since we had over 300 people register and many submit questions ahead of time. So I'm going to jump right in with a few of my own first, and then get to the ones that were submitted. The Keough School at Notre Dame, as you know, has a mission that we're particularly proud of, and it's to promote scholarship and evidence-based research and policies that are rooted in this Catholic social justice teaching concept of integral human development. In short, policies that first and foremost take into account human dignity, the human dignity of all people, especially the most vulnerable. So my question to you is, can this concept of integral human development, which is kind of a mouthful, but basically promoting human dignity, with all this going on in our country and in the world, can this concept apply to the work of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee? Does it fit into the conversation?
We could probably spend an hour in and of itself just talking about what individuals may mean by dignity, right? So I maybe am at a little bit of a loss to be able to answer the question appropriately, because we all probably approach that word differently. But let's assume that dignity begins with the ability to survive, the ability to feed your family, the ability to prosper and to leave your kids in a better position that you were, right? The access to the apparatus of opportunity has got to be sort of at the heart of a conversation about dignity. And I would argue so must self-determination, right? Dignity is about being able to decide for yourself, the ability for a community to decide for itself, the laws and the rules and the norms under which it operates, to not have that imposed on you by someone else. So I think it's very consistent with a U.S. foreign policy that is invested in promoting and building democracies, and a U.S. foreign policy that sees the ability to grow our power and influence and to protect our own interests by helping rescue people all over the world from economic peril and destitution, from conflict and war and famine. We have long been at the forefront of humanitarian relief around the world because we do see ourselves as having a moral obligation as the richest, most powerful, most prosperous country in the world to try to do good by others, but also because we believe that America actually protects itself best when we are winning friends. And one of the easiest ways to win friends around the world is to do good works. We also believe in democracy promotion, not just because we think it's the best way for people to live, but because we actually think that the more democracies that exist, the less peril is presented to the United States. We don't tend to go to war with democracies. Extremist groups don't tend to be able to recruit as effectively in democratic systems. So there are good moral reasons, but also reasons connected to more Machiavellian calculations about strategic interest to be having a forward-facing America that promotes humanitarian causes and promotes self-determination and democracy all around the world. Obviously, many of us would argue that the outgoing administration abandoned America's historic role with respect to leadership on democracy promotion and human rights. And my hope is that the Senate and the incoming Biden administration can restore some of America's leadership role in those areas.
Great. So let's turn to a couple of specific examples where both the moral role of the United States as well as our own national security interests come into play. And specifically looking at Yemen, which is a country that you've been paying particular attention to. Do you see any end in sight for that protracted, tragic conflict, and the role for the U.S., if any, in trying to end that violence?
Thank you for asking about this topic. When I went down to the floor 5 or 6 years ago to give the first speech in the Senate on the Yemen war, most of my colleagues, had no idea what was happening and what the U.S. role was inside a civil war at that point that, had already killed tens of thousands. Today, it is, likely the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. And the United States has been an instigator of injustice and famine and civilian death. My hope is that the Biden administration takes a fresh look at U.S. policy in Yemen, decides to unwind our participation in that civil war, and actually leads a regional conversation about how to bring an end to that conflict. It's a really complicated conflict because you have, domestic participants inside Yemen, the Hadi government on one side and the Houthis on the other side, but then you have the Iranians backing one side, you got the Emiratis and the Saudis backing the other side. So it's a very complicated conflict, but one that I think there is a pathway to resolution if the United States leads. But to the conversation we were having earlier, it is also a perfect example of where moral considerations line up perfectly with cold-hearted national security considerations. 85,000 to 100,000 children have died in Yemen of starvation or disease needlessly. Tens of thousands have died from the conflict itself. You have 1 million people who are infected with cholera inside that country. And right now, people in Yemen perceive the United States to be a big part of the reason why all of that is happening, because we're participating in the Saudi-led bombing campaign of Yemen. So from a moral perspective, the United States has to get out of this war, given how little it has achieved for our national security purposes and how many people have been hurt. But it really is hurting us from a national security perspective as well. And I'll give you just one example. Al-Qaeda in Yemen is maybe the arm of Al-Qaeda that has the clearest intention to hit us here in the United States. And they have grown over the last 5 years as that civil war has persisted. The more ungovernable space there is in Yemen, the more space they have to operate. There was a period of time where they controlled one of the major port cities in Yemen, had a pretty stable revenue source coming into AQAP. So long as this civil war continues, America's enemies grow stronger. And so from a moral perspective and a security perspective, my hope is that the Biden administration will get us out of this war early in 2021, but then not stop there. Send Tony Blinken or some high-level envoy from the United States to start convening peace talks.
Yeah. And along the same lines, in terms of parts of the world that are particularly volatile, you were a co-sponsor of the Global Fragility Act, which was signed into law at the end of last year, and as you know, is now being implemented. The focus of that legislation is on parts of the world that are coming out of conflict or on the verge of conflict. The specific countries will be chosen soon by the State Department. And then, of course, the pandemic just adds additional tension to those areas. What do you say to your constituents at home, the families in Connecticut who may ask you, why should we be putting energy into some of these, countries that, again, they haven't been selected yet, that are, sometimes in some cases quite small, but they're very precarious. And how would you answer that to constituents at home?
Well, I think I'd probably give two answers. One, listen, violent extremism still presents a threat to the United States. And these extremist groups, especially these sort of Salafist, Sunni extremist groups, tend to operate inside these conflict areas, whether it be in Africa, North Africa, or the Middle East. There are growing affiliates of Al-Qaeda and ISIS throughout Southeast Asia as well. And so the more conflict that exists, the more opportunity there is for these groups that have designs against the United States to grow. Second, these fragile areas, these conflict-ridden areas, are also the places where pandemic diseases can start. These are places that have really weak local public health infrastructure. And the one lesson we need to learn coming out of 2020 is that we better start spending all of the money that is necessary to prevent the next pandemic. So we don't have to be back here again arguing about how we are going to cobble together $1 trillion every couple of months to respond to a pandemic. The world doesn't need $1 trillion to build back up fragile states' public health infrastructure. It needs a fraction of that amount. So we're much better off as a nation spending that money now in a preventative way so that we never have to go through 2020 again than we are waiting for an outbreak to happen in a fragile state and for the United States to be back once again trying to stop the spread inside our own country.
Yeah, and related to that, and this is an area that a lot of my colleagues at the Keough School are putting a lot of time and energy and research into this issue of fragility, and we have a lot of expertise on issues of peace building. But building on the notion of being most effective with our resources, diplomatic resources, can you explain your motivation behind your legislation on creating a subnational diplomacy out of the State Department and how that would complement the other diplomatic missions?
We're going to have an enormous task on our hands, and President-elect Biden specifically and his team will have a major effort ahead of them, which is to rebuild America's credibility in the world, to rebuild our alliance structure, and to frankly make it a little bit harder for the leaders of countries that we would categorize today as adversaries to spin this anti-American story that they do in Russia or Turkey or China. And all of that work, frankly, can't be done by the State Department alone. The State Department needs help. So what we're proposing to do, and this is a bipartisan initiative, is to reestablish an office that will coordinate diplomacy carried out by state leaders and local leaders and county leaders. This is frankly something that our adversaries are already doing. The Chinese are brilliant at this. The Chinese send local level leaders all around the world to build partnerships, to sort of teach folks about the new Chinese economy, to spin often a very misleading story about China and its intentions. But America tends not to do that, at least not in a coordinated way. Our diplomacy is almost exclusively conducted by the White House and the State Department. And yet we have tens of thousands of local officials who would be great emissaries of this country. And so we want to coordinate that better. We want to be able to create people-to-people connections below the federal executive level. I think that's going to be a really effective tool to counter some of the anti-American narratives that are out there, but also to just build back up some friendships that have frayed over the last 4 years.
Mm. And thank you so much for that. And one other question before I start running through the many from our guests, but one other that's a particular interest to the Keough School, our faculty and our students, is on migration and refugees, which remains a global tragedy, and the numbers of refugees and forcibly displaced individuals is, I think we're upwards of 70 million people now across the globe. And what do you think should be the priority for the Biden administration coming in on this topic, and specifically on refugee resettlement here in the U.S.? And I know this is a huge topic, but just to narrow it down to that one area of U.S. engagement on refugee resettlement, if you could share your thoughts on that.
One of the last trips I made before the lockdown was to Lebanon, and I was there in part to see the refugee population. They don't have camps there, at least formal camps. The refugee population is integrated into the broader Lebanese community, but that country is hemorrhaging. They simply cannot continue to support that number of refugees. And they look at the United States and they just throw up their hands. They don't understand why the United States has been unwilling to help the Middle East with the Syrian refugee problem. The United States likes to go around and tell other countries what to do in Syria. We like to think that we are influential when it comes to the future of that country's conflict, but we can't be if we aren't doing something about the refugee problem there. And there are two ways that America can help. One is to admit more refugees to the United States. Luckily, that's an executive function. And so my hope is that President-elect Biden will immediately dramatically increase the number of refugees that that our country allows into the United States, to get that number up to 100,000 a year from what it has gone down to under Trump of around 5,000, 10,000. But then also to make the argument that we need more resources to help countries like Lebanon or Jordan with refugee resettlement. And I think that speaks to a broader fight that's ahead of us. We can't win in the world today if we're spending 20 times as much money on the Department of Defense as we are on the State Department and USAID. Because if we want to put more money today into refugee resettlement, then we have to take it from somewhere else. We have to take it from a democracy promotion account or an economic development account. The Defense Department very rarely faces that problem. When they need more money, they just come to Congress and get it. The Defense Department gets on average a $50 billion increase every year. That's the total size of the State Department and USAID. And yet the threats that are posed to this country today are really by and large not conventional military threats. It is very unlikely that Russia or China is going to invade the United States in the next 5 years. It is much more likely that foreign propaganda is going to take down our democracy, or another pandemic is going to overwhelm us, or climate change is going to destroy our way of life. None of those challenges can be met by the Defense Department. These refugee flows into unstable places, making those places even more stable, creating bulletin board recruitment material for extremist groups, all of that needs a much bigger diplomacy budget from the United States government. And part of what I'll be doing in 2021 is arguing to my colleagues that we need to start investing in some pretty big increases for the non-military tools that's presented to the chief executive of the United States.
And that actually segues nicely into one of the questions that we did receive, which is among the many inquiries regarding what you think the Biden-Harris administration should prioritize, specifically on Defense Department funding. Will you be advocating that they, similar to the position you just took, that they reduce Pentagon spending?
Well, listen, I find it hard to look at the pace of our adversaries' military spending and make the argument that we should be dramatically reducing the pace of our own. So I'm going to continue to argue for increased military spending. I just don't agree with the efficacy of increasing military spending by 50 or 70 billion dollars a year and increasing State Department funding by $1 or $2 or $3 billion a year. So I just think we have to right size these increases moving forward. I would argue that if the Defense Department's going to get 25 billion next year, the State Department should get 25 billion. I think I can make the case that the non-military threats that the United States faces are just as serious, are is equally as serious as the military threats. So to me, it's about figuring out a way to equalize the new investments that we're making on the DoD side and on the state and USAID side.
Mm-hmm. So let's just stay on DoD for just a few more minutes to address a topic that that some people did submit questions regarding, which is nuclear non-proliferation and sanctions. The topic of sanctions could obviously be an hour or more conversation, but specifically on the JCPOA, the Iran agreement that the Obama administration struck and the Trump administration withdrew from, or any other specific sanctions policies. Do you feel that the Biden administration should come in with a specific agenda around those? We have a group of my colleagues at the Keough School putting a lot of effort into making some recommendations, and they have put forward some specific recommendations on this topic for the incoming administration. How do you see this topic lining up with the other foreign policy issues that are going to be on their plate?
Well, if my team here hasn't connected with the Keough team, then we should. We're working on legislation right now that would reform our sanctions processes in the federal government because of my belief that American foreign policy has become far too reliant on sanctions. Often we use sanctions as a checkbox, as a sort of a box checking mechanism. You know, we can say that we care about topic A because we sanctioned a particular country or a particular set of actors, even though the sanctions don't end up having any material effect on the behavior. We largely undertake the route of sanctions because we simply don't have any other tools at our disposal to affect behavior. And those sanctions often end up hurting civilians, hurting regular people in these countries without actually changing the behavior of the country's leaders. And the more and more that we engage in these feckless sanctions, these sanctions that actually don't deliver a result, the weaker we become as a country. I argued from the very beginning of this most recent Venezuela crisis for the administration to be careful about the policy it employs there, because we could end up turning the Venezuelan people permanently against us, empowering Nicolas Maduro, and ultimately not getting any of our policy goals met. And I would argue that, you know, 2 years into the president's new Venezuela policy, that's exactly what's happened here. So part of my argument for increasing spending at USAID and state is because I think we've got to develop a new set of tools that we can deploy to try to affect other countries' behavior. Sanctions against Russia has not changed their behavior. But what if we actually had the ability to help finance energy independence projects in and around Russia's periphery? What if we could go to a country like Moldova and say, hey, listen, we're going to put some US dollars into helping you become energy independent of Russia. That would get Putin's attention, right? Because that's hitting him where it really counts. That would get him to come to the table on things that we care about. But we can't imagine that. So all we do is just sanction, 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 and it gets us often very little. When sanctions work is when they are part of a broader multilateral strategy. And that's why the Iranian sanctions did end up achieving the result they were intended to achieve, which is a nuclear agreement with that country because we were strategic and we were international. We joined together not just with our regular friends in Europe, but with China and Russia, and imposed sanctions that eventually brought the Iranians to the table. When you do it that way, they can be effective, but that's not how sanctions have been used by and large by the US government over the past few years.
So how do we, and I'm sure you're getting this question in one way or the other quite frequently, but whether it's with the Iran deal, Paris Accord, are you recommending in both of those cases that the Biden administration, as I believe they've indicated, should rejoin those two efforts? And more broadly, how does this work for U.S. credibility? Several of the questions that were submitted asked in one way or the other, what is our credibility? How does an incoming Biden administration restore some of that? What do our relationships look like with our allies? And it's pretty muddy waters. So starting off with those two specific international agreements, but more broadly, what is your advice to the incoming Biden-Harris administration on U.S. credibility?
Well, my advice clearly is to rejoin Paris and rejoin the Iranian nuclear agreement. One is a lot easier to rejoin than the other because we obviously will have to negotiate with the Iranians to enter back into that partnership. From my perspective, the very, very thin silver lining of the last 4 years of Trump's Iran policy is it essentially proved that the opposition to the Iran deal was wrong. Their theory was we should just keep applying sanctions, turn up the heat on the Iranians, and eventually they will be willing to come to the table on everything, not just their nuclear program, but also their human rights record, their support for terrorist organizations, their ballistic missile program. So that's exactly what Trump did. He withdrew from the agreement and spent 4 years turning up the heat, turning up the heat. He gave them a list of 12 demands that he wanted from the Iranians. And after 4 years of this policy, it produced nothing. None of the 12 demands were met. The Iranians didn't even come to the negotiating table on any of them. And they restarted their nuclear research program such that today they are maybe 2 or 3 months from a nuclear weapon versus 12 months back at the beginning of the Trump administration. On your broader question of how we restore American credibility, I'll just offer one thought. There's probably a million different answers to it. Listen, our foreign policy needs consistency. And we have had that consistency in the past from administration to administration. It didn't used to be that every incoming administration would just pull out of all the executive agreements that the prior administration entered into just because they would have written them differently. There was a sort of value on diplomatic stare decisis. And Trump blew that up. He had a lot of Republicans telling him, hey, stay in the Iran nuclear agreement, right? Because that'll make it a lot easier for you to do deals because there'll be a belief that a deal that you do might remain in a Democratic administration. Well, now the whole world is, I think, reluctant to do big diplomatic agreements with the United States because they're not sure that they're going to last, longer than the time it takes for the ink to dry on the paper. So that presents a challenge for the Biden administration. I would advise the Biden administration to, look at Trump's foreign policy. There are going to be places where you're going to have to take a right or a left turn. But maybe there are a few areas where you might have sort of tactical or strategic disagreements, but you continue because of the value of consistency. I think it would make sense for the Biden administration to take a couple agreements or a couple sort of routes of policy and continue them as a signal that Democrats and a Democratic president places a value on consistency.
Do you have a couple of examples?
Well, I would look at Afghanistan policy as an example. I think the way that Trump has pursued the withdrawal of American forces is ham-handed. I wouldn't have done it the way that Trump has done it. I don't think Joe Biden would have ordered the diplomatic talks in the way that Donald Trump has, but those talks are underway. They're ongoing. And I'm not sure that it would be smart in the long run for the United States to sort of blow up the Doha process, even though it's not, I think, the ideal way to wind down the Afghanistan crisis. So I think that's an example of a policy area where the Biden administration might be able to choose continuity.
Mhm. I've heard one of the nominees for the Biden-Harris administration, in answering a similar question, use the logic that, or suggest that the message to the world is that the Trump administration, some of the Trump foreign policy efforts were an aberration, and now we're back to normal, and things are, going to be more consistent as they have been in the past. Not to give you whiplash, but just to hit another topic that folks had questions about and pick up on this theme, with the Brexit decision actually moving forward at the end of this month. From what it seems to where we seem to be, Brexit will actually be official, and deal or no deal. The connection I'm making here is that the polls over the past 4 years in the UK have suggested that a new referendum on Brexit wouldn't necessarily be any different. So that wasn't an aberration. That vote 4 years ago on Brexit, can't just be dismissed as a fluke. So my point is, do you see any danger in the logic or the message that, the Trump administration, that was kind of a fluke, and now we're just moving on? I guess I'm obviously suggesting I think that is a little bit of a dangerous message, but what's your take on that? And then we can segue into your thoughts on the U.S. engagement on Brexit.
Yeah, I certainly don't think you can assume that sort of American foreign policy is settling back to normal. I mean, obviously, there's a good chance that Donald Trump will run again in 4 years, and even if he's not on the ballot, his way of thinking right now dominates the Republican Party, and that way of thinking really does call for a massive withdrawal of America from the world. So, sort of the Trumpism is the Republican Party today. So, I don't think that it's necessarily right to predict that we're back permanently. But I also think I'm sort of reacting to your description of what other people said, so maybe that's a little unfair. I also, am not terribly interested to just going back to the way things were 5 years ago. I was a supporter of President Obama. I think he, by and large, guided us ably through a bunch of tumultuous world events. But at the same time, the world's changing really quickly. Technology is changing. China is rising. And so I don't think we can go back to the way in which we interacted with the world in the 2000s. We're going to have to sort of set ourselves anew, because the world didn't sort of sit back and wait for Trump to leave. It kept changing. China kept rising. The Russians kept pressing. The climate continued to warm. We've got to sort of be where the world is at, rather than just try to go back to the policy we were enacting 4 or 5 years ago.
So, so on Brexit, right now, the U.S., will have options, will have choices to make. The Biden administration will have choices to make after inauguration, seeing wherever the Brexit deal lands or lack thereof. What is your advice if you were the one being inaugurated January 20th? What posture would you take towards Europe in this post-Brexit world that we'll be looking at?
Well, I clearly, first invest in the special relationship. We turned to Britain first, and we will continue to do that, even though they are no longer going to be part of the European Union. And so I think it's important for the United States and Britain to remain allies and for that alliance to be strengthened. Second, I think we should be in the business of trying to create a deeper partnership with the EU. And I would prioritize a trade deal with the EU over a trade deal with Britain. Just from a practical standpoint, it's a much bigger deal for the United States to be able to knock down some of the tariff and non-tariff barriers inside Europe today. And when we think about how to sort of counteract and manage the rise of China, we're going to need the EU side by side. Lastly, I think the United States can be a bridge at times between Europe and Britain. Now, I wouldn't advise us to be in the middle of this negotiation over how Britain leaves the EU, but going back to this issue of China, if we want to sort of figure out China policy moving forward, we should be doing it with the EU and Britain together. If we're going to sort of get tough with China on trade, let's say on agricultural trade, then let's do it with Europe and with Britain. And it may be the United States that needs to pull together that coalition. Very different than how the Trump administration pursued economic policy with China. It was United States alone, often frankly fighting with the Europeans on China policy. We've got to be together with Europe and with Britain. So we've got to sometimes, I think, act as a bridge between London and Brussels.
And you joined us last fall in our Washington office when we did things in person, and right, along with the Irish ambassador and others, talking of course about the potential impact of Brexit on Ireland. So I know your interest, along with others in Congress, is pretty solid. You were also joined by Congressman Peter King, and it seems to be one of many bipartisan issues in Congress in terms of the concern for how Brexit could impact the Good Friday Agreement and peace in Ireland, on the island of Ireland.
The good news is that they seem to have worked out the issue of the hard border. I actually was on the phone just last week with the Taoiseach, talking through some of these initial agreements that Britain and the EU have worked out. And I think that some of that was due to this bipartisan consensus you talked about. Pat Toomey and I wrote a letter to the administration expressing our bipartisan belief that the United States shouldn't support any agreement between Britain and the EU that didn't uphold the Good Friday Agreement. And so while there's lots of points of division between Republicans and Democrats here on this question of supporting Ireland, supporting the Good Friday Agreement and the peace process, we've been able to, I think, very effectively work across the aisle, and I've been glad to lead a lot of that in the Senate.
Just quickly on that, what are a couple other issues on the Foreign Relations Committee that you've seen the most bipartisanship around, or any particular partnerships that you've enjoyed and look forward to taking up in the 117th Congress?
Well, I am looking forward to some of these partnerships being a little bit easier in 2021. Trump just makes everything more difficult. Republicans are just, more reluctant to cooperate with Democrats because, they don't want to be on the receiving end of a Trump tweet for doing something bipartisan. Joe Biden is going to, be rewarding Republicans and Democrats for, reaching bipartisan compromise. So, some of the partnerships that I'm proud of that I want to build upon, one with the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, Jim Risch. He and I wrote a pretty big piece of legislation reforming America's global public health programming. We're believers that we have a diffusion of responsibility when it comes to global public health. We got a little bit in state, we got a little bit in the USAID, we got some at the NSC, we got some at CDC. We want to try to consolidate that leadership. We argue that the State Department should play a more leading role. I'm interested to continue working with Rob Portman on fighting Russian propaganda. We were successful in writing legislation creating a new office at the State Department, the Global Engagement Center, and that center has done great work to fight propaganda from Russia and other adversaries. We've got to do more there. And then back to Yemen, a lot of that work has been bipartisan as well. Todd Young, very conservative senator from Indiana, has been, folks in Notre Dame know him well. He's been an incredibly strong voice for humanitarian relief in Yemen. And so we'll look forward to partnering with him on making that case to the Biden administration, as we have together in making that case to the Trump administration.
Great. And now in the time we have remaining, I'm just going to do a little tour of the world with you. Not the entire world, but from some of the embassies who have representatives on this webinar, and as well as some of the students from the Keough School who've submitted questions. It's so broad to ask what your Africa policy is, and that is a question from some people, but there also are questions about particular countries and regions within the continent. So since there's a lot to cover there, what Africa-focused foreign policies do you think should be the priorities for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in this next Congress?
Well, this is, back to this conversation about resources. Right now, China is eating our lunch in Africa because they are able to deploy economic development and economic partnership resources that the United States simply does not have. So we need to supersize our International Development Finance Authority. We reformed it a few years ago. We now have to dramatically increase its ability to finance projects. And give it sort of specific authorizations in Africa around power, around clean water, around port security. Second, we need to be plussing up our development aid accounts. The Finance Authority does loans. The aid side of U.S. National Security Toolkit gives grants, and we can give very few of those into African countries. I would argue that we should prioritize public health. Chairman Risch and I have a proposal in which we would sort of copy the Millennium Challenge grant for global public health and enter into agreements with nations. Many of them, I think, would be in Africa, in which we would put up a pretty substantial sum of US dollars to rebuild local public health infrastructure, but in exchange for reform commitments. And then just turning to North Africa for a moment, the Biden team is going to have to sort of step back and do a broad reassessment of our Egypt policy and our Libya policy. Egypt's crackdown on dissent has become intolerable. It ultimately is going to snap back on the Egyptians. And we've got to decide whether we want to be in the security business with a country that is so brazenly locking up political dissenters, including some American citizens. And then inside Libya, we've got to lead again. We've taken a backseat there. We've been very unclear about who we support. We technically support the government in Tripoli, but then Donald Trump has sort of made all sorts of overtures to General Haftar. We've got to get on the right side in Libya, which is the Tripoli government. And then we've got to get back to the negotiating table, lead rather than follow, and also try to use the leverage we have over other countries like the Emiratis to get them out of that war. There's all sorts of proxies in Libya that don't need to be. The United States can try to apply some pressure to countries to come off the battlefield and sit down at the negotiating table.
Thank you for that reflection. In terms of some of the relationships that President Trump has developed with particular leaders, the Philippines, Brazil, what relationships are you most concerned about in terms of the U.S. connection to some countries that may historically not have been wise or fully aligned with U.S. values?
I don't know that he has a relationship with Bolsonaro or Duterte. I mean, their politics align, and he tweets nice things about them, but I don't know that I don't know that he spends a lot of time on those relationships. But I think it speaks to this broader turn to nationalism, this broader anti-democratic turn that is happening all over the globe today. And we have to be cognizant that the fight we're having in the United States right now, in which millions of Americans, as we speak, are willing to throw out an election, is reflected in a bigger problem. And I would argue that in the United States, in the Philippines, in Brazil, in parts of Europe, democracy isn't delivering for people right now. Democracy isn't working. The elites, the billionaires, the corporations do better and better, even in a pandemic. And ordinary, average people who are working hard tread water at best. Many days, their heads below water. And so all over the world, people are saying, why is democracy so great again? Right? Why is this worth continuing? Because it's not doing much for me. It did something for my grandparents. They seemed to be able to do better and leave their kids with a better life, but I'm not going to be able to leave my kids with a better world. My kids aren't going to do better than me. So I'm going to entertain other options. Donald Trump, Bolsonaro, Duterte, Orban, they show up with other options, more efficient means to reorder the economy than having to struggle through a democracy. So let's have that conversation. Let's figure out why democracy is so broken. Let's figure out why economic elites have so much power. Let's figure out why social mobility is gone for billions of people all across the globe. And I think if we settle that question, then you just won't have as many of these nationalists, these sort of would-be anti-democrats having so much success around the world.
Great. And now I'm just going to wrap us up with your subcommittee. So for the incoming Congress, assuming you remain the ranking member, as I'm sure you'll have the option to lead your subcommittee in the next Congress, several folks did submit questions asking about what the priorities for the U.S. should be in the, whether it's the South China Sea, the Asian region overall. So I know it's a lot to ask you to opine on, but for Asia, for the larger region and the area that your subcommittee covers, where do you think Congress should be focused in the coming years?
Yeah, my subcommittee has this very broad title. It is actually sort of more so the Middle East subcommittee, and then there is a separate subcommittee for South Asia. But that being said, it's still a really important question and a good place to end. Let me just give sort of two possible avenues of policy when we think about the future of American interests in South Asia. One is a multilateral trade agreement. I was not a big believer in the TPP model. I didn't get to the point where I had to have an official opinion on it. But to me, we've been writing trade agreements for corporations instead of writing trade agreements for workers. We have a chance now, having sort of brought Republicans and Democrats together to all get behind the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, to take that framework and apply it to a new multilateral agreement in Asia. I don't see any way for the United States to have influence in the region if we aren't creating closer economic ties with lots of countries in that region who are always going to have China as their #1 economic partner, but want to have the United States pretty close behind, so they can say to the Chinese, hey, if you're going to screw me on, in this area, then I've got a line of potential partnership with the United States. So as a Democrat who has traditionally voted against trade agreements in the past, I would love it if the Biden administration pursued a trade agreement in Asia that looked a little bit less like TPP and a little bit more like USMCA. Second, back to this question of what we do with the Europeans. The Chinese caught the world with our pants down on 5G, right? We were not ready. They had midwifed this technology domestically. They sprung it on the world. It was better than we thought it was going to be. and it was priced at a level that Western alternatives like Nokia couldn't compete with. So we've got to get together with our European partners and say, okay, what's the next 5G? Well, it could easily be 6G, but it also might be an AI product. It might be an advanced battery product. Let's make sure that we are spending public dollars alongside private companies in a coordinated way between the United States and Europe so that we can have a competitor product for Chinese technology exports in a way that we frankly didn't on 5G. We ended up just trying to bully countries into not accepting Chinese 5G, even though we didn't really have anything else for them to use in replacement that was as cost competitive or at the same level of quality. So that partnership, I think, is going to be really important. Now, it involves a higher level of public subsidy for industry and technology than the US is traditionally interested in, save for the defense industry. But I think we have to start thinking about all of these new technologies under a national security umbrella. So we are willing to spend tons of public money when it comes to creating the next joint strike fighter. I'm not necessarily sure that the question of 6G will be less integral to our national security conversation than the follow-on program to the joint strike fighters. So that, I think, is a big part of our South Asia policy, is coordinating with Europe on industrial policy so that China doesn't continue to lap us on technology exports.
Great. I appreciate that very thoughtful answer, which again, that conversation could take us into a whole nother hour if we had that time, but of course we don't. I'm just going to finish with one last question. Is it possible that the pandemic will, after we get through this, assuming we all get through this, that it will bring the world closer? I know there's a separate question if it will bring Americans closer, but when you think of the foreign policy, can you see it as something that connects us more than divides us at the global level?
I'm worried that that won't happen. And I go back to my earlier answer. Here in America, the pandemic is separating us economically, right? The billionaires are gobbling up more and more wealth. And at the end of this, more Americans are going to be economically fragile than ever before. A lot of these jobs that disappeared during the pandemic aren't coming back. And the same thing has happened in other parts of the world. And so to the extent that the pandemic exacerbates income and wealth inequality, I think it will leave ample room for more friction, for more division, and for more anti-democrats to rise up through the ranks. So yes, you can make the case that, after the pandemic is over, we should all logically and intellectually come to the conclusion that if we don't coordinate better together, another pandemic will sweep the globe. That is obviously the right answer. My worry is that the economic wasteland that will exist in large parts of the world after the pandemic is done will ultimately create more fragile societies, more fragile democracies, and frankly, more problem points that have to be addressed, making those partnerships harder. So I think that's just another reason why we have to be invested in this conversation about fixing democracy and fixing our economies, because the pandemic is going to make the injustices inherent in our economies even worse.
Well, certainly the citizens of Connecticut, including many family members of mine, as well as all Americans, are very fortunate to have you on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee tackling these extremely important issues, advising the incoming Biden administration, and hopefully setting us on a good course as we tackle the pandemic and try to start the next decade on a healthier footing. And I really appreciate your time during this very busy week in Washington, right before the holidays. And we're all very grateful from the University of Notre Dame and the Keough School of Global Affairs for your time today, Senator.
Well, Maura, great to see you again. You've been a friend for a long time, and the Keough School has been a great addition to the Washington scene. We'll look forward to partnering with you for a long time to come. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, take care, Senator. Thank you, everybody.